Welcome to this webinar on Minerva Analytics' recently published briefing on dual-class share structures and sunset clauses. This discussion will examine some of the briefing's key findings. I'm Grogan-Fenn, newsletter editor at Minerva Analytics. I'm joined by Sienna Neela, senior analyst at Minerva and the lead author of the briefing.
Thanks, Jack. Our briefing looks at why dual-class share structures are gaining traction, the governance risks they pose, and how sunset provisions can help balance founder control with shareholder rights.
I'm also joined by Shareholder Resolutions research analyst Caoimhe Taylor, co-author of the briefing.
Thanks, Jack. I'll focus on shareholder proposals and voting trends, why efforts to eliminate DCSS are declining, and how investors are adapting their strategies to protect their influence.
So, Sienna, what key aspects of DCSS do shareholders need to know about, and why should they potentially be of concern to investors?
DCSS grant disproportionate voting rights to select shareholders, typically founders or early investors, allowing them to retain control despite holding a minority of equity. This structure can limit accountability where minority shareholders have reduced influence over governance, entrench management as founders can block changes even when performance falters, and dilute shareholder democracy because voting power is not aligned with economic interest. While DCSS may protect long-term vision, they often undermine transparency and responsiveness to shareholder concerns, especially without robust sunset provisions.
Caoimhe, why have DCSS become commonplace in some sectors like technology and in certain regions like the US?
These share structures are popular in the technology sector and regions like the US due to founder-led innovation where founders seek control to pursue long-term strategies without short-term market pressure. Permissive regulation in US exchanges like NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange allow DCSS without mandatory sunset clauses, and IPO dynamics with high-demand IPOs such as Meta and Alphabet normalizing dual-class share structures as a tool to retain strategic control. In contrast, regions like Asia impose stricter governance standards, limiting DCSS adoption.
Sienna, can you tell us about the 4 different types of sunset clauses and which of those can prove the most problematic for shareholders?
The 4 main types of sunset provisions include time-based sunsets, which are triggered after a set number of years post-IPO, dilution-based sunsets, which are activated when insider ownership falls below a threshold. Transfer-based sunsets are initiated when shares are transferred to non-permitted holders. And event-based sunsets are linked to specific events such as founder death or departure. Transfer-based provisions are most problematic as they are easily evaded by keeping shares within approved groups, whilst time-based clauses are preferred by investors for their predictability and enforceability.
DCSS and sunset clauses are a polarizing issue for some, Caoimhe. Can you tell us what Minerva's view on DCSS and sunset clauses is?
So in Minerva's view, the one share, one vote principle is a core pillar of good corporate governance that Minerva has always championed. Although DCSS can be beneficial to companies in certain circumstances, evidence suggests that any benefits diminish significantly over the longer term. Minerva introduced a new voting policy approach in 2024 to identify US companies with dual-class share structures that do not have a time-based sunset provision limiting the lifespan of the deviation to a maximum of 7 years. The voting policy has also been introduced in other regions, such as the UK, where regulations around dual share voting structures have been weakened.
Sienna, why might the number of shareholder proposals looking to eliminate DCSS be declining, and how big a concern should this be?
Proposal activity is declining due to a number of reasons. Founders often hold majority voting power, making proposals ineffective. An example of this is Dropbox Inc., where the combined chair and CEO owns nearly 80% of the voting power. US regulators have not mandated sunset clauses either, and companies increasingly bundle DCSS extensions with unrelated proposals, reducing transparency. While concerning, this trend reflects strategic shifts in investor engagement, such as focusing on voting policies and direct dialogue rather than formal proposals.
Caoimhe, where are the main differences in regulatory and policy approaches to DCSS, and what impact does this variation have for shareholders? And what is driving the divergence in shareholder proposal activity between the US and Europe?
So globally, 3 models exist. The prohibitive model in regions such as Australia and Colombia, where DCSS are banned. The restrictive model, predominantly in Asia, as countries such as Hong Kong, Japan, and India allow DCSS, but some form of sunset clause is mandated by law. And the permissive model, this is mainly apparent in the Anglo-American jurisdictions such as the US, UK, and Canada, where DCSS are allowed with no mandatory sunset clauses. This impacts shareholders, as shareholder rights can vary widely. Investors face inconsistent protections across markets. In the US, the lack of mandatory sunsets means prolonged insider control. Further, in Europe, recent directives such as the MVSD are increasing DCSS flexibility, potentially weakening governance standards. Considering the divergence in proposal activity, the US has more entrenched DCSS and fewer proposals due to typically those success rates as mentioned previously, whereas Europe has stronger shareholder rights, more activism, and more regulatory support. Shareholder protections vary widely. In the US, permissive rules means prolonged insider control. Europe is moving towards greater flexibility following recent directives, while Asia maintains stricter safeguards for shareholders.
Sienna, what does the future hold for DCSS, and how can shareholders prepare?
Looking ahead, DCSS are likely to remain common in high-growth sectors, especially technology. However, global trends suggest increasing pressure for governance safeguards. Europe's recent directives and Asia's restrictive stance may influence other markets. Investor activism may lead to stronger coalitions pushing for time-based sunsets and transparency measures. And major institutional investors are tightening voting guidelines, opposing DCSS without robust sunsets. So how can shareholders prepare? Shareholders can advocate for mandatory sunset clauses, ideally time-based sunsets of 7 years or less, push for disaggregated voting disclosures to expose any incidents of insider influence, and engage proactively with boards and oppose bundled resolutions that extend DCSS. The next few years will be pivotal. Those who act early to influence governance frameworks will help to shape a more balanced market.
Thank you, Sienna and Caoimhe, for taking us through some of Minerva's DCSS briefing's key findings.
Thanks, Jack. It's clear that dual-class share structures and sunset provisions will remain a critical governance topic. We encourage investors to stay engaged and advocate for stronger safeguards.
Thank you. And as shareholder activism evolves, understanding these trends is essential for protecting voting rights and long-term value. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Minerva Analytics provides global proxy voting and stewardship expertise. We also deliver actionable ESG insights. Our approach takes each client's individual preferences into account, empowering shareholders to implement custom voting guidelines for companies with DCSS. For example, this could include holding individual directors accountable when there are deviations from the one share, one vote principle. As we look ahead to 2026, we also invite you to steer the conversation by completing Minerva's Horizon Scanning Survey. This will be sent out to everyone who attended today's session. Your input will directly inform our research and guidance around emerging stewardship challenges next year. The survey closes on the 9th of January 2026. Subscribe to our newsletter for updates on the survey, as well as our upcoming briefing looking at changes to the UK's Stewardship Code and their implications. The briefing will be published later this month and followed by a webinar in January 2026. Thank you for joining us today.